Welcome to A Look Inside. I'm your host, Demetria Head, and today we have a very special guest all the way from Australia, author Roger Marsh. Welcome,
Hi there.
Roger.
Thank you, Demetria.
Okay, so we're going to talk about your books. Let's start with Echoes in the Wind. And I still have my signed copy. I did read it. It's been a while since I read it, but it was emotionally resonant. And I never thought that I'd be into the war stories or the military life, but it was a very interesting book. So let's start with Echoes in the Wind. So why don't you share with me your own journey and how it influenced the story and what prompted you to transform your experiences into the novel?
Yeah, so I was born into a family with a military past, and my father had been in the Navy. So, in some ways, I was in the armed forces from the day I was born. Even though I wasn't really aware of it necessarily, Dad was, you know, he'd been in the Navy a fair while, and he was very he did things in a certain way and instilled certain things in us, all like myself and my sisters. So um, going to the military for me was seemed like a natural thing, but he insisted on that I get a university education as well.
Mhm.
He revered that kind of education, um, so I did that. But one of the things that I found that started to drive me to write, there were three things. The first thing was I realised that when I joined, that I actually had transitioned into a different culture.
Mhm.
Um, so I come out of, Australian culture. It has a lot of similarities to American culture in certain respects. Somewhat individualistic,
Right.
and that sort of thing. You go from being in an individualistic culture where you only really have to worry about yourself and your stuff,
Mhm.
and you're thrust into a culture where, yes, that other person next to you is your responsibility, and if you don't make sure they're doing okay, we're going to kick your rear end, and you're going to be in serious trouble. I hadn't initially thought about this. I thought, no, this is normal. I'm familiar with this. I'm familiar with the language, even though Dad was Navy and I went to Army. But over time, I realised that I'd become quite different culturally to my peers, the people I'd known in the past.
Mhm.
You know, and one of the problems for people who leave, particularly the regular army in Australia, is that they're making a transition back to a culture that they don't understand.
Mhm.
And the military civilian divide causes issues. Now, sometimes it can be funny because the way you express yourself. Australian Army is a very confrontational, abrasive environment. And when you're in it, you don't really notice because everybody's like that. And you're just used to a very direct way of doing things.
Mhm.
But when you're dealing with people who aren't in that environment, they can just sometimes feel completely crushed by you because you're like, that is the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. Um, and you're just saying what you think, and they're not used to you saying what you think. And I take it personally. And you're like, oh. So that's part of what I wanted to do was to give people a window so they could look inside military culture and understand, well, particularly army culture, and understand people and why they are the way they are. That they're that way for a reason. There's important reasons why they're like
Mhm.
that. The second thing was that I I needed to download my head
Mhm.
because from the day I joined to the day I left, my time in the army was frantic. It was incredibly busy. And sometimes when bad things happen, you have to park your emotions somewhere because you don't have time to process it. You have to park your emotions and deal with the problem that's in front of you, however horrible it might be, because if you don't, then worse things will likely to happen. So having to park your emotions, after a while, you start to get a bit of a backup. And after serving in the army for most of my working life, I had a fair bit of backup that I needed to get out there. So writing fiction actually helped me, possibly more than a biography and autobiography would have done, simply because I had to take an experience, understand it, and then give it to somebody else, give it to another character who has his own story. And I think that actually helped me to understand my own story better. And then to almost, as a psychologist said to me, it's almost like you've gone through exposure and narrative therapy all at the one time by having done that. She was really pushing me to keep writing. And the last aspect really was another reason why I started writing was the encouragement of one friend in the army in particular. Because he said, no, you tell a good story. You need to tell our story, not the sanitized version that, the army might want to tell, but tell the whole thing, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And, put it out there. And if you use fiction, his words were, you can protect the innocent and throw the guilty under a bus without ever getting sued. So, and I'm like, yeah,
Right.
I'm up. So,
Right. You mentioned that it actually helped you. So would you say that it provided some sort of catharsis, just having to relive your story while you're telling it and processing it and translating it onto paper, into book form for the whole world to read? Was it cathartic?
yeah, and it still is. So these two books are part of a series of 4. So I finished the 3rd one and I'm editing, and I'm a fair way through the 4th one. But particularly after writing A Wind, a Bitter Tears, the 2nd book, the sense of relief after I wrote that, I was like the most amazing weight off me, because I'd carried a lot, and I look back on my army career and I think, I don't think I could have done anything differently that would have prevented any level of, emotional, spiritual, other kinds of backlog. It always happens simply because you just don't have time to process things. But it was incredibly helpful. It's the best thing I've ever done for.
That's really good.
For processing stuff, because you actually understand your own experience to write fiction based. And Echoes in the Wind is the kind of, it's basically a story of scars and how the decisions you make in reaction to that are really very influential and can have huge knock-on effects in your life, right down the track. So yeah, but compared to A Wind, a Bitter Tears, it's a much more mild tale. But I also wanted to tell a relational story about the army. I didn't want to create a Jack Reacher.
Right. Okay.
who was all about the use of force to stop wrong. No, I wanted to have far more about the mindset, but also to portray relationships that occur in the army, the sort of things that brings people together, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Right. So when you were writing your story, was it a challenge for you to figure out how your personal story would not just resonate to other people who've experienced military culture and military life, but a wider audience, like me, for instance? Was it a
Yeah.
challenge to be able to do that so that it does resonate even with the average citizen?
Yeah, I had to translate it basically. I made a very deliberate decision when writing the books that I would have a sort of a structure editor who just looks at the plot, not the commas and the full stops, but just looks at the plot. Now, one of them was military, and she had studied creative writing at university. So she gave a lot of story structure feedback, but the other one had never served at all. And I had her, so she could make notes and say, "What's this mean? What are you saying?" And I was surprised at how much came back as incomprehensible the first
Oh,
time.
wow.
And but army's problematic because in the Australian Army, even if you strike a cavalry soldier, their dialect of army speak is very distinct, and other people from within the Australian Army will have trouble understanding them sometimes. So if you get that person and you portray a cavalry soldier very genuinely, which I've tried to do in as one of the characters in the books, I've had to actually alter his speech somewhat so that other people can understand what he's on about. Because a classic example is if one cavalry soldier's messaging another one, and they're out on the town and they're wanting to meet up, they'll text with "send lead trace over," and that makes no sense to the average person. It's a very genuine way they interact, but I had to make decisions about how, and so I used a lot of footnotes and ended up with a second book's got a glossary as well, so that people can, okay, what's this mean? And then the character of Rob in the book, and it's not just Australian Army people, there's Royal Marines, and they have a very distinct dialect as well. And probably more so than anywhere in the Australian Army. So actually crafting in genuine, realistic dialogue caused a lot of head scratching. Some of the things I kind of went through my own experiences and thought about strategic things to put in that would help drive the plot. That also to drive my objectives, which is to help people understand the military. So the prologue of Echoes in the Wind really gives just a little snapshot of the awful decisions that have to be made, and how can you make them, and what effects those decisions have later on. So yeah, I wasn't, I didn't go through and think, oh, we'll just fictionalize an account of my life and go through it blow by blow, because it'd
Mhm.
actually be quite boring. Um, you've got to drive a narrative that engages people and
Right.
communicates.
Mhm.
So that the goal of communicating and giving people a window into the military helped me to just have like, oh, I need to translate this,
Mhm.
um, and be so, and also be appropriately sensitive. I'm not a very politically correct person, but
Mhm.
there are some military nicknames that I'd probably avoid putting in a book because they're wrong. They're really, really wrong. But the Australian Army is quite like, there was one big Aboriginal guy who was an infantryman I knew. He was from the
Mhm.
Northern Territory, and his surname was White. And the Australian Army being the place it is, his nickname was Not So, um, because he was not in the least bit white, and he was
Mhm.
hilarious, absolutely hilarious guy.
Mhm.
But if your surname is Wise, you'll also get the nickname of Not So.
Oh,
Or if your surname,
wow.
or if your surname is Smart, you'll get the nickname of Not So. I have a friend whose surname was Alexandrovich, and his nickname was A to Z because his recruit instructor that he had when he came through couldn't just looked at his name and went, I can't pronounce that. Your name is now A to Z. Um, there was a Sudanese kid, and I actually used that
Mhm.
nickname in the book, whose was called Titanic because he couldn't float,
Oh, wow.
couldn't swim. So they nicknamed him Titanic. Just went poof. He could run like,
Wow.
his muscle density was such that he had very little natural buoyancy.
Mhm.
And
Oh, wow.
I watched, he's just like, douche, jumps in the water, and
Mhm.
he's on the bottom. Oh, we better fish him out.
Wow.
No drowned recruits today, thank you.
That would
So,
probably be me.
yeah, or you have, there was, somebody who was a bit gloomy who would get the nickname Cyclone for being a slow moving depression.
Oh.
So they're often humorous, um, but
Mhm.
everybody, um, I nearly ended up with Bulldozer being my nickname because the first time I went to during doing an obstacle course, we're meant to
Mhm.
go over a 6 foot wall. Now, when I joined, I was, I'm not 6 foot tall anymore. I've shrunk a bit because marching and running with a pack on shortens you over time, um, just a little. But I was 6 foot tall and 210 pounds and fit. But being 6 foot tall and 210 pounds, I if I start running, it's hard to stop. And I went for this 6 foot wall, and you're meant to sort of coordinate, put one foot on the wall and use it to basically, you end up kind of vaulting yourself over. I ran
Mhm.
into the wall. I just ran into it because I mistimed the jump, and this boom, I hit this wall. And the physical training instructor, this corporal, was doubled over laughing, could hardly breathe because I had, and she's like, do it again. So I'm like,
Oh,
okay.
wow.
And I mistimed it again, and this time the wall moved when I hit it. And this corporal, she couldn't keep going. She couldn't keep yelling at me because she was laughing too hard. Then I smashed during another thing. I smashed myself in the face with a weapon and
Oh, my
nearly
goodness.
broke my nose. And I got harangued for 10 minutes solid about that, but it was mainly comedic.
Mhm.
Um, it was somebody like starts with, "Did I tell you to smack yourself in the face with a weapon?" No, you didn't. Well, what did you do it for? So I had blood streaming down my face, and it was.
Wow.
He wanted to perpetuate the nickname of Vikings
Hmm.
because he said I look like an extra from Vikings. So
Mm.
it's it's an environment where if you stuff up, you're just going to end up. It's going to be a nickname, and the U.S.
Hmm.
military is very. The pilot,
Hmm. Yeah.
US Navy pilot nicknames are all pretty well based on, like, one U.S. Marine helicopter pilot I came across. His nickname was Poco, and it was actually on his flight helmet. Somebody asked him,
Okay.
how'd you end up with POCO, like POCO? And he went, well, it stands for pukes on CO. We're like, oh, really? He was drunk and he vomited on his CO.
Oh, wow. I was a CEO upset about that?
I dare say yes.
I can imagine.
uh, we had Marines in Darwin. I wish I'd been able to put this in the book. There was a US Marine Corps gunnery sergeant up there who he was the most devout. I mean, I'm a Christian, but this guy was
Hmm.
really, really devout Southern Baptist guy. Looked like he
Okay.
slept standing up because he was so perfectly ironed all the
Oh,
time.
wow.
It's like, does this guy ever sleep? And we had a young US Marine cause some trouble, and he'd got drunk. He tried to pick a fight with an Australian soldier. He got beaten up pretty badly,
Hmm.
and two Aussies decided to take pity on him because in the Northern Territory, where the main barracks is, if you wander outside the front gate and just go for a walk in the bush, you're likely to get eaten by a crocodile because
Oh,
there are crocodiles in the creeks 100
wow.
meters from the front gate of the base. So
Oh, my goodness.
they didn't want to see some lonely American go wandering off into the night and end up getting eaten. So
Hmm.
two young Aussies grabbed this kid and started dragging him back to the Marine
Hmm.
accommodation, and he was objecting, and so they smacked his head into a light post to persuade him against his foolishness. And they're thinking, oh, we're going to be in so much trouble because we've increased the amount of injury this kid's got.
Hmm.
And they come into the Marine accommodation, and there's this Marine gunnery sergeant. They're like, oh no. Because even the Aussies were scared of this guy. And this Marine gunnery sergeant says, I take it this Marine has walked home via several very solid objects. And they're like, this sergeant, this often happens when this Marine is drunk. Thank you for your kindness. You may go. And so they're like, sweet. Oh, they run away. And the next morning, I came into work. This gunnery sergeant was running this still hungover soldier um,
Hmm.
um, around the 6 kilometre ring road in the barracks.
Hmm.
And I heard him yelling out, that's the poison leaving your body, as he was vomiting into a bush. He just thrashed him with PT the next morning. Uh, so, yeah, those sorts of things are, there are all of these sort of stories laying around in the background. And I've,
Hmm.
sometimes very careful. Does this actually help drive the narrative, or is it just an interesting side quest or something like that? Because while that's, I would have loved to have put that in one of the books.
Hmm.
Actually, I don't have the place for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Eh, I would love to have read that in one of the books, though, because it's a very interesting story.
He was.
I think a lot of people would have laughed.
I did put a gunnery sergeant in the second book, who was kind
Okay.
of based on that personality. Um,
Okay.
but the Marines and the US Marines and the Australian Army often gel fairly well
Hmm.
because the way and the duration of training is quite similar.
Hmm.
Uh, Australian Army doesn't yell as much, but it's still sort of, it's still a similar journey.
Right.
We instruct differently, and it's just a cultural thing, really. We're
Hmm.
um, British instruct differently to us as well, though probably more similar. Um,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, I have
Hmm.
one more question before we get into A Wind of Bitter Tears.
Hmm.
So, what kind of feedback, if any, have you received from other military veterans or even everyday people who've read your book? Are there have you been giving any feedback that's been particularly meaningful or insightful pertaining to the book?
Yeah, I've had some really, I've been really overcome by the positive feedback I've got. And this goes for both books. One friend who we didn't deploy at the same time, but he deployed on a pretty rough trip to Afghanistan. And he'd been other places as well. He just said to me that you've captured the soul of the soldier. And that to me was really the greatest feedback I could have got because, you know, his job had been, we call high risk search team. So searching for bombs, improvised explosive devices, your IEDs and so on. And the stress that those guys lived under day by day was just eye watering. And yeah, he just said you've captured the soul of the soldier, and I thought, wow, I've hit the mark. If somebody with that kind of experience of probably one of the worst jobs through the war on terror, yeah, civilians have been pretty good as well. A lot of feedback is I had no idea that this is the way you were. Um, but it's interesting the way. So my female main character has probably got the most negative reaction.
Really?
Yep. So the character of Anne from the novels, and it's often from women that she gets a negative reaction, and I never expected that. um, so Anne's a bit of she's a blend of people from traits of my wife through to people I served with and women I served with. But I think it came down to the fact that she was just a strong personality, and there were some people who felt deeply threatened by her because
Wow.
she just wouldn't hold back if she thought you know something was wrong or somebody was being a twit. She'd
Mhm.
get stuck into them, and often women in the military, they need to be on the front foot
Mhm.
when it comes to basically saying to a male, don't stuff with me.
Mhm.
Um, and that's other males in the military. Not so much with civilian males. Civilian males over here, anyway, are often a bit scared of military women, and so don't tend to um,
Mhm.
give them a hard time. But yeah, the so I tried to create that. A lot of people, I mean, particularly female friends in the military, have kind of grabbed me and said, "Thank you for writing this
Yeah.
person because I connect with her."
Right.
But on the
Right.
civilian side, there's been some who just know I cannot stand this woman because she's so aggressive. I'm like, oh, well, good thing you're not in the army. You meet a lot more people. Uh, but I didn't expect
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Mhm. So we'll move on to A Wind of Bitter Tears. So one thing I do want to know about this is when you were depicting the emotional and psychological toll in the setting of army life, what aspects of the military life did you find most important to convey in the novel?
Yeah, well, two. One is combat. Um,
Mhm,
Combat, by its very nature, is a highly compressed experience.
mhm,
You don't, you just, yeah, you got to fall back on your training. You don't have a lot of time to react to things and go, wow, that was a big experience in life. I might just go and write in my journal about that now. You don't have time to do that.
right. Mhm,
And so it's going to take a toll, and it is. Um, I'd be worried if it didn't, to be honest.
mhm,
If somebody comes out of that whistling and feeling fine, I'm like,
mm.
yeah, I'm not so sure. But that, yeah, absolutely. That's one aspect that I really had in mind is I need to show people how it wears you down. It's like having your soul sandblasted.
Mhm.
It's, it will strip the impurities away. It strips the rust off, but it can also eat right through you. Um,
Wow.
and after a time, it can wear you down to the point where you disinhibit, that you are just so quick to turn to the use of force as an option.
Mhm, mhm,
And it's because you're used to such an escalated threat level. And it
mhm,
takes time to actually sort of, wear that down because you're exposed to horrible experiences, you experience visceral emotions, and you don't have your mum there going, you know, wow, that was weird. You don't have any
mhm,
anchor to a previous life. You only got people who are in that life with you,
mhm,
and it's good. You know that can lead to an erosion of yourself after a time. So that was one aspect, and I think those things are I think well known. Have been written a lot about. How
mhm.
you'd be worn down, and you only have to look at. And it's actually a bit of a problematic trope, I think, in movies of the broken veteran.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I wanted to portray somebody who was badly knocked around, but hadn't lost themselves.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
particularly in the second book. The other thing I think is hard, in terms if you want to talk about awful experience, it's very emotionally draining.
Mhm,
Uh, Confronting toxic leadership
mhm,
is really, really tough. Um, I think that I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that the mental health toll of toxic
mhm,
leaders is as severe as combat. Indeed, possibly more severe because with combat, you kind of expect that this is not going to be pleasant, to say the least. That this is
mhm,
going to be difficult, and I possibly won't come out the other end of this feeling good.
mhm,
And you are prepared for that. You actually trained in going, okay, when you see these sorts of things, it's going to be hard. And certainly when I went to Afghan, the CEO I had was brilliant. He just said, look, you know, if you feel bad, reach out for help, because he said these mental health things are just like any other illness or injury. The sooner you get it treated, the sooner you stick up your hand for help, the sooner you'll get better. So he created a really good culture in the unit at the time.
Mhm.
And just like, no, it's just real life. Get on top of it, do what needs to be done. But
Mhm.
with toxic leaders and the effect they have, they actually really um, they really eat away at you, or bad decisions made by a hierarchy that start to have impacts on lives on soldiers and that sort of thing. That's actually
Mhm.
a form of a form of difficulty that you don't expect. You know it can happen, but you don't expect, and it can have a real corrosive effect in a person's life because they feel violated by the way
Mhm.
somebody's acting. I spoke to a senior NCO once. So Australian Army and British Army ranks work quite differently to the US Army. So our warrant officers are not the same. So warrant
Mhm.
officers are actually senior NCOs in the Australian Army. They don't have a King's Commission. They have a King's Warrant, which is
Okay.
different. So the ranks basically go private, lance corporal, corporal, sergeant, warrant officer second class, warrant officer first class, and they're your
Okay.
non-commissioned ranks. And I was talking to a guy who had been a warrant officer first class, he'd been a regimental sergeant major, and he was relating to me a particular personality that I'd come across, who was a very nasty piece of work,
Mhm.
and warrant officer had him as a lieutenant when he was a sergeant. And he said, to this day, I regret not having beaten that guy into a pile of blood and snot.
Oh, wow.
Because he said the damage he did to people's lives through his military career was such that
Mhm.
he was like, no, I wish I'd just beaten that guy to a pulp
Mhm.
and
Wow.
ended his military career. He said, I would happily gone to jail just to get rid of him from the
Mm.
army.
Wow.
And, if you look through that guy's army career, you could see somebody who had consistently damaged the capability of the fighting force by being such a
Mhm.
toxic, crazy thing.
Right.
So toxic leadership has a huge cost
Mhm.
anywhere, whether it's in a school district or whether it's in a university. But when you're in
Mhm.
an organized army, it has where the stakes are very high for what you do, and the cost of making mistakes can be
Mhm.
real. Yeah, the yeah the problem's massive. So there are two
Mhm.
aspects, and they both come out in the book. Um, so it's how you deal with that kind of thing. Um, I think it's one of the big challenges in life.
Mhm.
How do you deal with a toxic leader? Um,
Absolutely. Right.
yeah, very big challenge.
Mhm. So would you say that you were satisfied with achieving that goal of driving the plot and the character development forward and highlighting the price of honor, that kind of theme, and the effects of power abuse?
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to I wanted to portray it because it's not talked about. The
Mhm.
the price of honor is the price of doing
Mhm.
your job well. Yeah, that is. But the effects of power abuse is not talked about. Um, and it's like I can't remember who I was talking to. I was talking to somebody who just said, "Look, there's nothing wrong with having power and having privilege. It's what you do with those things that's important."
Mhm.
So he gave an example. No, that's right. It was a commanding officer I'd had. Because he had been exchanged to the British Army, and he'd been in the Irish Guards. Now, those prestigious regiments in the British Army you're just as likely to come across somebody who's a lord or a baron amongst the officers. And one of
Okay.
his friends, while he was in the Irish Guards, was a lord, but he had joined the army and thought that he'd take his career through until he was a captain or a major, and then he would leave and run the family estate. But then he discovered that his father, with whom he didn't get on very well, and who was a toxic leader, had wasted so much money on doing some very bad things that the family estate was nearly bankrupt.
Wow.
And one of the consequences of that, if the estate went into bankruptcy, would be if somebody bought the estate off his family, all of the farmers, all of the other workers who were tenants on that property would be in danger of losing their entire livelihoods and being without a home. And so this guy said, okay, well, the army's a guaranteed income. I'm going to knuckle down and make the army my career, and I'm going to pay off all of my father's debts. Because I can't have it on my conscience that all these good people who are tenants on my ancestral lands will get kicked out because of the dumb things that my father did. And so he used his power and his privilege to do good for those who would be affected if he didn't. Whereas there are other people, like this guy's father, who don't care about anyone else. And they will use power for themselves rather than to actually serve others. And, you know, the Brits actually, like their Officer Training Institute, Sandhurst, the motto is serve to lead. And one of their little rubrics, one of their sayings is, if serving others is beneath you, then leading others is beyond you. If you can't get down on your knees and get dirty, then you're no good as a leader. Now, you know, people fail at that, but I think it's a good way of understanding what leadership's meant to be about, particularly when you're in a high stakes organisation.
Right.
So I think I looked at, and you know, I came across toxic leaders, and sometimes I saw somebody who was traumatized and didn't know how to deal with it, and so they took it out on someone else. But other times I saw people who just loved power and who loved oppressing others and making other people feel the weight of their power. And to me, you know, those sort of people needed to be removed because they're actually going to undermine the fighting capability.
Right.
You know, so it was something, and a lot of people just say thank you. They said to me, like, thank you for saying that, because it's a thing that we had to deal with. And all militaries do. You know, any organisation, I've probably some of the worst bullying I've ever come across being described to me, not personally, was a friend from uni days who after he went to university, he became an entomologist. He researched insects. And the bullying that he encountered in that job was, I was like, oh my word, you know, if somebody treated me like that, I'd beat them up badly. I would beat them to a pulp. That's just incredibly unacceptable. But so, and it was, you know, you think, oh, okay, a bunch of scientists, you know, they should be all about, but no, jealousy and power struggle, it was there as well. So humans can be pretty difficult.
Oh, absolutely. So do you think that you conveyed all the emotions and specific messages, not just in the title, but in the entire book for A Wind of Bitter Tears. Do you think
Yeah,
you're satisfied with that? Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, I
Mhm.
I just felt completely wrung out, but very relieved after having written it. And some of the scenes took me a while to write. Um,
Mhm.
yes, particularly there's one battle in that second book that I was just, I just felt like I was being run over by something. And I sent it to the editor I had, who was not military in background, and she said, "I find this scene really confusing and disorienting." And I went, "Well, that's battle. It's confusing and disorienting." So, like, yes, and she,
Mhm.
we pushed that backwards and forwards. So
Mhm.
I made it so people could actually follow what was happening far more readily
Mhm.
than you perhaps would if you were actually tied up in one yourself.
Right.
Um, because when the bullets start to fly, your focus narrows, um, and it takes a lot of mental presence of mind to be able to be situationally aware when you're in that environment. And
Mhm.
so I was trying to portray that fight of mental compression,
Mhm.
um, to maintain that situational awareness rather than just thinking survive, 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 and then freezing. Um, so yeah, I think that it was incredibly beneficial, but I think it also, um, I did had a couple of military friends just message me and go, "Mate, that battle, dude, did you have to? Like, did you have to do that to me? Sorry, trigger warning." Uh, there was a couple I actually told them beforehand when they bought the book. Went, "Mate, just to let you know, here
Mhm.
there are others who I didn't know so well." He's just like, "Oh man, I could have. I wish you'd told me that was in." Okay, yeah,
Well, thank you, Roger, for agreeing to sit down with me and do this interview. But before we wrap up, can you tell us where can we purchase both of your books that are out?
so they're available on the usual online suspects, um, Amazon and so forth.
Okay.
Um,
So Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
yep, yep,
Okay.
yep.
Okay. And
So
we're
the
also going to put that in the description box with the links. I do have the links as well for Amazon. And
yeah.
also, for those who are interested in following you on social media, on Instagram or Facebook, so that they can keep up with your latest book projects, where can they follow you on Instagram?
I'm there under Roger Marsh author. I'm just trying to better check that. That's where I'm mainly present. I often sort of just ping the stuff on Instagram across to Facebook. So yeah, Roger Marsh underscore author.
All right. And
Um,
we'll make sure that we have that in the description as well.
yeah, uh, it's it's been a great journey, and
Mhm.
the third book, which is The Devil in the Downdraft,
Okay.
is coming out quite soon. Um, I'm just going through it. It's more about the way in which a military career ends, and the
Okay.
fourth book, which is The Angel of Wrath, is about um, life after the military and
Okay.
the mental and social adjustment
Mhm.
that needs to happen.
Okay.
Ultimately, veterans leaving need to find a community,
Hmm.
and it doesn't have to be a community of military people. It probably should be a mix.
Hmm.
Um, but people who've been through that need to find a community because they feel like they've lost one when they leave.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. So so it'll help those who are trying to wind down back into civilian life and, trying to get back to some sense of normalcy outside of military life.
Yeah. And it's a journey. It takes time. Like when I first
Hmm.
left, if I had to go into what I call a red zone,
Hmm.
where, so when I was newly out of the military,
Hmm.
I was walking our dog, one of our dogs, when he was a pup. And this person had a German Shepherd that wasn't on a leash, and they were out with it, and it just came rushing up to attack my dog. And I yelled at this dog, big, projected military style voice, and the
Hmm.
dog laid down and rolled over on the spot. I really tried to assert dominance very quickly, and I gave the owner both barrels, like, do not walk, have a dog that will show aggression to other dogs off a leash. What kind of
Hmm.
idiot are you? I tore this bloke apart. And afterwards, I felt like I just like this, like my body was this racetrack of adrenaline.
Yeah.
And then, not very long ago, actually, I had to do the same thing because somebody had left their gate open and this dog came rushing out to
Oh, wow.
get stuck in my dogs.
Mm.
And I used a loud voice. I asserted dominance over the dog. And the owner came out and I just said, no, you're right. You've made a mistake, because she was really apologetic. And I said, it's okay. I just used a loud voice to stop, because my dog won't take it. If you try, now that he's a bit older, if you try and sink your teeth, if another dog tries to sink his teeth into him, it won't end
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
And I was trying to, and I came away from that, I'm like, hang on, the adrenaline isn't surging through my body. I've been able to use that more assertive, aggressive persona and then switch it off,
Mhm.
uh, which I would have struggled to do, 4 years ago. And I found that, I thought, oh, I've grown, I've changed. And I'm like, woo,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. You did, you sometimes felt, um, because you've been keyed up for so long, it takes a while to
Right.
spool down.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Well, thank you, Roger, for doing this interview and sharing a lot of valuable information. I think more than just military people are
Oh,
going to need to
absolutely.
read those books.
I,
But thank you so much.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
And again, I'll be sure to put those descriptions of where everyone can purchase your books on Amazon and all your major online retailers. And of course, be sure to follow Roger Marsh on Instagram at Roger Marsh _author.
Correct. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Roger.
No worries.